How many nations are members of the UN today?
In 2005, the United Nations, UN, membership stood at 191 nations, with the most recent additions having been Switzerland and Timor-Leste, East Timor, in 2002. The membership of the UN grew steadily after it was founded in 1945. Originally there were 51 member states, including Canada, France, the United Kingdom, the USSR, today the Russian Federation, and the United States. Within a decade, 25 more countries had been added to the UN's membership roster. By 1965 there were 117 members, by 1975 144 members, by 1985 159 members, and by 1995 185 members.
What were knights?
In the Middle Ages, 500-1350, knights were armed and mounted warriors who were also landholders. In other words, they were noblemen who took up arms. A knight might have been the lord of a manor who vowed to fight for the feudal lord, the lord of the fief where the manor was situated. During the Carolingian Age, during the 8th and 9th centuries, when a monarchy was established in Western Europe, a feudal lord might also have been a knight in service to the king. In times of war, any man who pledged loyalty to his lord and took up arms on his behalf would become a knight, who later might receive lands from the lord or king as repayment. During the Crusades, 1096 to 1291, knights were made of men who were not landowners. They were instead designated by primogeniture. The eldest son would bear the honor of becoming a knight. Knighthood was traditionally conferred by a blow on the shoulder with the flat side of a sword. Feudal knighthood ended by the 16th century. Today, the only vestige of this tradition is found in Britain, where knighthood is an honorific designation conferred by the king or queen on a noble or commoner for extraordinary achievement.
When did modern surgery begin?
Modern surgical techniques were developed during the late Renaissance, largely owing to the work of one man. French surgeon Ambroise Paré, 1510 to 1590, called the father of modern surgery. Prior to Paré's life work, physicians had regarded surgery as something lowly. They left this dirty work to barber surgeons. As a young man living in the French countryside, Paré became apprenticed to one such barber surgeon. When he was only 19 years old, Paré entered Paris's Hôtel Dieu hospital to study surgery. Becoming a master surgeon by 1536, he later served as an army surgeon and then as physician to 4 16th century French kings Henry II, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. Paré also built a flourishing surgical practice and authored works on anatomy, surgery, the plague, obstetrics, and the treatment of wounds. Opposing the common practice of cauterizing, burning, wounds with boiling oil to prevent infection. He introduced the method of applying a mild ointment and allowing the wound to heal naturally. Peer was renowned for his patient care, which he based on his personal credo, "I dressed him, God cured him."
Why is Beowulf considered an important work?
Beowulf, the earliest manuscript of which dates to about a.d. 1000, is the oldest surviving epic poem in English or any other European vernacular. It was written in Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons in England, used c. AD 500-1100. Its author is unknown. Categorized as a folk epic, Beowulf tells the story of a Scandinavian warrior hero who, on behalf of the Danish king, fights and kills the fearsome monster Grendel. Then slays the monster's mother, and finally engages a fire-breathing dragon in mortal combat. Because of its combination of Christian and pagan themes, scholars believe the epic may have been written as early as 700 or 750.
Are the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution the same?
The two terms describe interrelated and sequential European intellectual movements that took place from the 1500s to the 1800s. Together, the movements shaped an era that would lay the foundations of modern Western civilization. Foundations that required the use of reason, or rational thought, to understand the universe, nature, and human relations. During this period, many of the greatest minds in Europe developed new scientific, mathematical, philosophical, and social theories. Scientists came to believe that observation and experimentation would allow them to discover the laws of nature. Thus, the scientific method emerged, which required tools. Soon the microscope, thermometer, sextant, slide rule, and other instruments were invented. Scientists working during this time included Sir Isaac Newton (1642 to 1727), Joseph Priestley (1733 to 1804), and René Descartes (1596 to 1650). The era witnessed key discoveries and saw rapid advances in astronomy, anatomy, mathematics, and physics. The advances had an impact on education. Universities introduced science courses to the curricula, and elementary and secondary schools followed suit. As people became trained in science, new technologies emerged, complicated farm machinery and new equipment for textile manufacturing and transportation was developed, paving the way for the Industrial Revolution.
What was the Gang of Four?
The Gang of Four was a group within China's Communist Party that, under the leadership of Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, 1914 to 1991, 21 years his junior, carried out its own power-hungry agenda and plotted the takeover of the government from Chairman Mao, 1893 to 1976. A former stage and movie actress, Zhang was also an astute student of politics. In the late 1960s, at which time she had been married to Mao for some 30 years, she became associated with former army commander Lin Biao, and the pair conspired to stage a coup. In 1970, at a Communist Party conference, they announced that Lin had surpassed Mao as the leader of the people. 1 year later, Lin and Zhang tried to overthrow Mao's government. Failing, Lin fled the country. His plane was later shot down, and Zhang succeeded in covering up her involvement in the affair. But she continued her subversive activities, associating with 3 other members of the Politburo, the chief executive and political committee of the Communist Party. In 1974, Mao publicly admonished his wife and her cohorts, Wang Hongwen, Yao Wenyuan, and Zhang Chunqiu, to cease their power-seeking activities. Infighting in the party had already resulted in Mao's loss of influence. 2 years later, on September 9, 1976, Mao died. The Gang of Four were arrested and thrown into prison. There they remained for years while the case against them was formulated, resulting in an indictment that consisted of 20,000 words. Finally, on November 20, 1980, the Gang of Four expanded to include 6 other conspirators, were put on trial charged with counter-revolutionary acts, including sedition and conspiracy to overthrow the government, persecution of party and state leaders, suppression of the people, and plotting to assassinate Mao. During nearly 6 weeks of testimony, Jiang's machinations were revealed to the 600 representatives who attended the trial, held in an Air Force auditorium in western Beijing. As well as to the Chinese press, foreign press was prohibited from attending. Her laundry list of malicious acts as ringleader of the Gang of Four included public humiliation and even torture of Communist Party rivals, execution of her personal enemies, inspiring the fear of the masses, and purging the arts of anything that did not carry a revolutionary theme. Zhang, while not denying many of these acts, insisted that she had all along acted at the behest of her husband, Mao. During the explosive testimony and presentation of evidence, which included tapes and documents substantiating the state's case against Zhang, she made outbursts, was temporarily expelled from the courtroom, was dragged screaming from the courtroom twice, and even taunted her accusers into executing her, saying it would be more glorious to have my head chopped off. In the end, Zhang and 1 other conspirator were found guilty and sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. And the 8 others were also found guilty and charged with sentences ranging from 16 years to life in prison. Zhang died on May 14, 1991, in what appeared to be a suicide.
What happened at 3 Mile Island?
The March 1979 accident, a near meltdown at the nuclear power station at 3 Mile Island. Outside Middletown, Pennsylvania, near Harrisburg, was eventually contained. Had it not been, the damage would have been on a level with that of the Chernobyl, Ukraine, disaster, which happened some 7 years later. Instead, 3 Mile Island served as a wake-up call, reminding the American public and its utility companies of the potential risks involved in nuclear energy. The sequence of events at the nuclear power plant, which is located on an island in the Susquehanna River, was as follows. At 4 a.m. on Wednesday, March 28, an overheated reactor in Unit 2 of the power plant shut down automatically, as it should have. Metropolitan Edison Company operators, guided by indicators that led them to believe water pressure was building, and an explosion was therefore imminent, shut down those pumps that were still operating. The shutdown of all the pumps caused the reactor to heat further. Then, tons of water poured out through a valve that was stuck open. This water overflowed into an auxiliary building through another valve that was mistakenly left open. This final procedure, which took place at 4:38 a.m., released radioactivity. Since there was no cooling system in operation, the reactor in Unit 2 was damaged. But this was not the end of it. The radiation within the buildings was released into the atmosphere. And at 6:50 a.m. a general emergency was declared. Early that afternoon, the hydrogen being created by the uncovered reactor core accumulated in a containment building and exploded. Since hydrogen continued to be emitted, officials feared another catastrophic explosion. Worse yet, they feared the reactor would become so hot that it would melt down. The effect of a meltdown would be that the superheated material would eat its way through the bottom of the plant and bore through the ground until it hit water, turning the water into high-pressure steam, which would erupt, spewing radioactivity into the air. As technicians worked to manage the crisis, radiation leaked into the atmosphere off and on through Wednesday and Thursday. On Friday, the governor of Pennsylvania ordered an evacuation. Some 144,000 people were moved from the Middletown area. The situation inside the plant remained tenuous as a hydrogen bubble developed and increased in size, again raising fear of explosion. Meantime, public alarm was mounting as the media attempted to monitor the ongoing crisis. Finally, on Sunday, April 1, the plant was visited by President Jimmy Carter, 1924. At about the same time, the hydrogen bubble began to decrease in size, ending the crisis.
What does 5440 or fight mean?
The slogan refers to a dispute between the United States and Great Britain over Oregon Country, which in 1818 treaty allowed both nations to occupy. This was the territory that began at 42 degrees north latitude, the southern boundary of present-day Oregon, and extended north to 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude, in present-day British Columbia. During the 1830s and early 1840s, American expansionists insisted that U.S. rights to the Oregon country extended north to latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes, which was then the recognized southern boundary of Russian America, roughly present-day Alaska. The 11th President of the United States, James K. Polk, 1795 to 1849, used the slogan in his political campaign of 1844. After he was elected, Polk settled the dispute with Great Britain, in 1846, and the boundary was set at 49 degrees north. The northern boundary of what is today Washington state and the border between the United States and Canada. This agreement reached without the fight threatened in the slogan gave the United States the territory lying between 42 and 49 degrees north latitude and Great Britain the territory between 49 degrees and 54 degrees 40 minutes north latitude as well as Vancouver Island. The United States portion is present-day Washington, Oregon, and Idaho as well as parts of Montana and Wyoming.
Why did Andrew Johnson vow he would burn Nashville before surrendering it?
It seems a strange thing for a politician to say about his home state's capital city. Andrew Johnson had served Tennessee in both the U.S. House of Representatives 1843 to 53, and the U.S. Senate 1857 to 62. He had also been governor 1853 to 57. But after the Civil War broke out, the Southern Democrat made a surprising move. He sided with the Union. This show of allegiance was largely owing to Johnson's strongly held belief that the South's secession was unconstitutional. Having thus made his stand, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, saw fit to appoint Johnson as the Union's military governor in Tennessee. When rebel forces surrounded Nashville and seemed poised to take it, Johnson proclaimed he would sooner burn the city before surrendering it. But he was forced to do neither. In mid-December 1864 Union forces used the hand-cranked Gatling gun, invented in 1861, to help defeat the Confederate forces.
Who invented basketball?
The ball and hoop game was invented by Canadian-American James Naismith, 1861 to 1939, in December 1891. An instructor at the YMCA College in Springfield, Massachusetts, Naismith was asked by the head of the physical education department to come up with a game to keep students active indoors during the winter months. It had to fit inside the confines of a gym, have no physical contact, use a soft ball, and give everyone who participated a chance to handle the ball. Naismith nailed 2 peach baskets, which he found in the storeroom, to balcony railings at each end of the school's gym. Found a soccer ball, divided his class of 18 men into 2 teams, and introduced the men as it would turn out. The rest of the world to the game, which was later dubbed basketball, 2 words. Improvements to the game came over the next 2 decades as it spread in popularity. In 1910 the important change of allowing ball handlers to move by dribbling was made. In 1916 the rules were changed to allow dribblers to shoot the ball.
Who was the first European to traverse the Bering Strait?
The Bering Strait, which connects the Arctic Ocean and the Bering Sea, is 53 miles across at its most narrow point. The first European to traverse it was Danish navigator Vitus Bering, 1681–1741, in 1728. The explorer, for whom the strait and the sea were named, had been employed by Tsar Peter the Great. 1672–1725, of Russia to determine whether Asia and North America are connected.
What was the Bay of Pigs?
Bay of Pigs is the name of an unsuccessful 1961 invasion of Cuba, which was backed by the U.S. government. About 1,500 Cuban expatriates living in the United States had been supplied with arms and trained by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. On April 17, 1961, the group of men who opposed the regime of Cuba's Fidel Castro, 1926, landed at the Bahia de Coquinos, Bay of Pigs, in west-central Cuba. Most of the rebels were captured by the Cuban forces, others were killed. In order to secure the release of the more than 1,100 men who had been captured during the invasion, private donors in the United States accumulated $53 million in food and medicine, which was given to Castro's government in exchange for the rebels' release. The failed invasion came as a terrible embarrassment to the Kennedy administration, and many believe the Bay of Pigs incident directly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
What are the origins of slavery in America?
The roots of slavery in North America date back to about 1400, when the Europeans arrived in Africa. At first, the result of African contact with Europeans was positive, opening trade routes and expanding markets. Europeans profited from Africa's rich mineral and agricultural resources and for a while abided by local laws governing their trade. Africans benefited from new technologies and products brought by the Europeans. But the relationship between the two cultures soon turned disastrous as the Europeans cast their attention on a decidedly different African resource: the people themselves. as the Portuguese in West and East Africa began trading in human lives and the Dutch in South Africa clashed with the native people who, once displaced by the wars, became servants and slaves. Other Europeans began calculating the profits that could be made in the slave trade. By the end of the 1400s, Europeans had landed in the New World. Soon Europe's established and emerging powers vied for control of territories in the new lands of North and South America and the West Indies. The Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutch, English, and Swedes all made claims in the Western Hemisphere and began setting up colonies. By the mid-1600s, triangular patterns of trade emerged. The most common route began on Africa's west coast, where ships picked up slaves. The second stop was the Caribbean islands, predominantly the British and French West Indies, where the slaves were sold to plantation owners and traders used the profits to purchase sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee. These raw materials were then transported north to the third stop, New England, where a rum industry was thriving. Their ships were loaded with the spirits before traders made the last leg of their journey back across the Atlantic to Africa's west coast, where the process began again. Other trade routes operated as follows. 1. Manufactured goods were transported from Europe to the African coast. Slaves to the West Indies, and sugar, tobacco, and coffee transported back to Europe, where the route began again. And 2. Lumber, cotton, and meat were transported from the colonies to southern Europe. Wine and fruits to England, and manufactured goods to the colonies, where the route began again. There were as many possible routes as there were ports and demand for goods. The tragic result of the triangular trade was the transport of an estimated 10 million black Africans. Sold into slavery, these human beings were often chained below deck and allowed only brief, if any, periods of exercise during the transatlantic crossing, which came to be called the Middle Passage. Conditions for the slaves were brutal and improved only slightly when traders realized that should slaves perish during the long journey across the ocean, it would adversely affect their profits upon arrival in the West Indies. After economies in the islands of the Caribbean crashed at the end of the 1600s, many slaves were sold to plantation owners on the North American mainland, initiating another tragic trade route. The slave trade was abolished in the 1800s, putting an end to the forced migration of Africans to the Western Hemisphere.
Why was John Paul II called the People's Pope?
Because during his 27-year tenure, he dramatically changed the public perception of the Pope. Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyla, 1920–2005, was named Pope John Paul II on October 16, 1978. Becoming the first non-Italian head of the Roman Catholic Church in 455 years. From the first moments of his service, it was clear that this was a different kind of pope. Upon his election, he greeted the cardinals of the conclave his brothers standing rather than seated, which was the tradition. A few weeks after his election, he leaned out the windows of the Vatican Palace to sing carols with 50,000 children gathered in St. Peter's Square to celebrate Christmas. Instead of limiting his concerns to the administration of the Church, he traveled far and wide to carry the message of Christianity to the people. Crowds, often numbering in the hundreds of thousands to millions, gathered to see him around the globe. In 1979 he made his first trip to the United States. After which Time magazine ran a cover story with the headline, "John Paul, Superstar." Pope John Paul fought for freedom of religion everywhere, even challenging his communist homeland. His call for solidarity contributed to the downfall of communism in Poland and across the Eastern Bloc. He published regularly memoirs as well as books of prayers, lessons, meditations, and poetry. Despite his active ministry on the world stage, he remained a traditionalist, never wavering from the ages-old teachings of the Catholic Church. When he died on April 2, 2005, he was hailed both as a holy man and a man of peace by Christians and non-Christians alike.
What does Epicurean mean?
While Epicurean has come to refer to anything relating to the pleasure of eating and drinking, it is an oversimplification of the beliefs of the Greek philosopher Epicurus, 341 to 270 B.C., from whose name the word was derived. While Epicurus did believe that pleasure is the only good, and that it alone should be humankind's pursuit, later scholars misinterpreted the philosophy as a license for sensory excess. In actuality, Epicurus defined pleasure not as unbridled sensuality but as freedom from pain and as peace of mind, which can only be obtained through simple living. In about 306 BC, Epicurus established a school in Athens, which came to be known as the Garden School because residents provided for their own food by gardening. There he and his students strived to lead lives of simplicity, prudence, justice, and honor. In this way, they achieved tranquility, the ultimate goal in life. According to the philosophy of Epicureanism, he further believed that intellectual pleasures are superior to sensual pleasures, which are fleeting. In fact, he held that one of the greatest and most enduring pleasures is friendship. These ideas were put forth by the Greek philosopher and writer Lucretius, c. 99 c. 55 BC, in his poem On the Nature of Things. While the Epicurean school endured for several centuries, ultimately Christian leaders deemed the philosophy a pagan creed. However, some critics have posited that the writer of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament of the Bible was likely a member of the Garden School and that the epistles of St. Paul in the New Testament were strongly influenced by Epicurean thought. In more recent times, Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, author and signatory of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States, was a self-proclaimed Epicurean.
What are the four humors?
The four humors are the bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, originating in the heart, brain, liver, and spleen, respectively. One work assigned to Greek physician Hippocrates, c. 460 c. 377 BC, Nature of Man, asserts that illness is caused by an imbalance of the four humors, fluids, in the body. The presence of these humors was thought to determine the health and personality of a person. This belief prevailed for centuries but was finally discredited by modern science. During the Middle Ages, 500-1350, each of the humors was assigned certain characteristics. Someone of ruddy complexion was believed to have an excessive amount of blood in his or her system. That person would be sanguine, cheerful and optimistic in character. The word sanguine is derived from the Latin word sanguis, meaning blood. Someone who had an imbalance resulting in more phlegm was considered phlegmatic, and would have a slow and impassive temperament. An individual who had excessive yellow bile was considered hot-tempered, and a person who had more black bile in his or her physiological system was believed to be melancholic.
How are religions classified?
Religion, which is a system of beliefs that usually centers on whatever is beyond the known or the natural, is commonly divided between elementary forms and higher religions. Some elementary forms, or traditional religions, are animism, the belief in spirits in nature or in natural objects, ancestor worship, revering the spirits of the dead, and totemism, belief in a mystical relationship between a group of people and an emblem. Animists might believe in spirits living in the sea or in the mountains. Believers in ancestor worship will both honor and fear the spirits of dead family members for if they are neglected by the living. These spirits are believed to be able to bring harm to their descendants. Within clans, some tribal peoples adopt totems, such as a lion or a turtle. Totemists will be careful throughout their lives not to harm the animal or object that serves as their clan's emblem. Higher religions are those that embody a concept of transcendence. Higher religions are classified as polytheistic, believing in many gods, dualistic, believing in equally powerful gods of good and evil, monotheistic, believing in one God, and pantheistic, believing in God as the forces and laws of the universe, or the worship of all gods. Religions are further classified as revealed or non-revealed. Revealed religions are those that followers know through divine agency. Both Christianity and Islam are revealed religions. Non-revealed religions, such as Buddhism, Brahmanism, or Taoism, are known only through inquiry.
Were all the battles of the American Revolution waged in the Northeast?
No, there was also fighting in the southern colonies. But the struggle between the American colonists and the British was further complicated in the South by the presence of slaves. Landowners feared that any fighting in the vicinity would inspire slaves to revolt against them. Knowing this, the British believed they could regain control of the southern colonies more readily than those in the north. In November 1775, the British governor of Virginia offered to free any slaves who would fight for the British. As many as 2,000 black slaves accepted the offer and took up arms. But there were also patriots in the South. It was Virginian Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, who uttered the famous words, "Give me liberty or give me death." In late February 1776, Patriot forces confronted and defeated pro-British colonists near Wilmington, North Carolina. The British troops who were sailing from Boston, Massachusetts, to North Carolina to join the loyal colonists arrived too late to help. They instead sailed on to Charleston, South Carolina, which was also the scene of fighting that summer.
Why was the Mars Pathfinder project important?
The historical space project yielded a tremendous amount of data, even more than scientists had planned or hoped about the planet, totally reshaping many long-held notions about Mars, the fourth planet in the solar system. Pathfinder landed on Mars on July 4, 1997, and deployed a 2-foot-long robotic rover called Sojourner. The small rover collected what project scientists described as a staggering amount of data. 2.3 billion bits of information about the planet, 8.5 million measurements of temperature and pressure, 16 chemical analyses of rocks, soil, and other surface materials, and 16,500 pictures. Among other things, the new data caused scientists to rethink the planet's color. Long believed to be red, the color is now described as a deep amber or butterscotch. The evidence gathered by Sojourner supports the notion that there may have been life on Mars. Future projects aimed at studying the planet's properties will further explore the theory that there was once life on Mars. With the success of Pathfinder, project scientists turn their attention to improving the data gathering capabilities of future rovers, including the addition of brushes to the robot, so that dust can be collected from rocks on the surface of Mars, which is a distance of 155 million miles from Earth.
How old is country music?
Old-time music or hillbilly music, both early names for country music, emerged in the early decades of the 1900s. By 1920, the first country music radio stations had opened. and healthy record sales in rural areas caused music industry executives to take notice. But it was an event in 1925, in the middle of the American jazz age, that put country music on the map. On November 28, WSM Radio broadcast the WSM Barn Dance, which soon became known as the Grand Ole Opry, when the Master of Ceremonies, George D. Hay, took to introducing the program that way, since it was aired immediately after an opera program. The show's first performer was Uncle Jimmy Thompson, 1848 to 1931. Early favorites included Uncle Dave Macon, 1870 to 1952, who played the banjo and sang, and Roy Acuff, 1903 to 1992, who was the Opry's first singing star. Millions tuned in, and soon the Nashville-based show had turned Tennessee's capital city into music city, USA. In the 1960s and again in the late 1980s and 1990s, country music reached the height of popularity. While holding on to its small-town, rural-based audience who were the show's first fans.
How did Eli Whitney invent the cotton gin?
American inventor Eli Whitney, 1765 to 1825, is credited with developing the cotton gin, a machine that removes cotton seeds from cotton fibers. A simple cotton gin, called the churka, dates back to ancient India, 300 BC. But Whitney's gin would prove to be far superior. In 1792, Whitney, who had recently graduated from Yale University, was visiting the Georgia plantation owned by Catherine Littlefield Greene, widow of American Revolution, 1775 to 83, hero General Nathaniel Greene, 1742 1786. Whitney observed that short staple, or upland, cotton, which has green seeds that are difficult to separate from the fiber, differs from long staple, also called sea island, cotton, which has black seeds that are easily separated. The latter was the staple of American commerce at the time. In 1793, Whitney, who is described as a mechanical genius, completed an invention that could be used to clean bowls of short staple cotton of their seeds. He patented it the next year. The machine worked by turning a crank, which caused a cylinder covered with wire teeth to revolve. The teeth pulled the cotton fiber, carrying it through slots in the cylinder as it revolved. Since the slots were too small for the seeds, they were left behind. A roller with brushes then removed the fibers from the wire teeth. The cotton gin revolutionized the American textiles industry, which was then but a fledgling concern. The increase in cotton production was as much as 50-fold. One large gin could process 50 times the cotton that a slave laborer could in a day. Soon plantations and farms were supplying huge amounts of cotton to textile mills in the Northeast, where in 1790 another inventor, British-born industrialist Samuel Slater, 1768 to 1835, had built the first successful water-powered machines for spinning cotton. Together the inventions founded the American cotton industry. Whitney struggled to protect his patent, but imitations of his invention were already in production, prompting the U.S. government to allow his patent to expire. Though he did not profit from his cotton gin, he went on to devise a system of interchangeable parts, which introduced the idea of mass production and revolutionized manufacturing.
Why was Ford's Model T important?
The enormous success of the Model T, a Ford Motor Company car introduced in 1908 and manufactured until 1927, has been the source of extensive analysis and commentary by historians, sociologists, economists, business writers, and pop culture experts. The Model T has been credited with not only changing America but with defining it. When Ford Motor Company founder and President Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947, unveiled the prize Model T in October 1908, he hailed it as a motor car for the great multitude. The product lived up to the promise. The internal combustion vehicle had been in production in the United States only since the 1890s. But in the decade preceding the Model T's debut, manufacturers and consumers alike had come to regard the horseless carriage as a luxury item, custom-made for wealthy Americans. Ford had conceived of a different and, as the company would advertise throughout the century, a better idea, a car that was simple to operate, easy to service, comfortable, and affordable. The Model T had a wooden body on a steel frame, 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine. Tank capacity of 10 gallons, in the touring sedan, or 16 gallons. In the runabout, and a completely enclosed power plant and transmission. It was also lighter than other models. Through large-scale production, based on a system of interchangeable parts, the Model T took 728 minutes, just more than 12 hours, to build and sold for $850, lower than the price of other automobiles, but still beyond the reach of the average American. Nevertheless, 17,000 Model Ts were bought by American consumers the year they were introduced. Ford improved production methods to realize greater economies and lower the price each year. Sales steadily rose. The company raised eyebrows in the business community when it offered workers an 8-hour day for $5 a day, twice what other factory workers were earning. Ford explained that this was merely good business practice. By raising the wages of his factory workers, Ford enlarged the potential market for his Model T. In 1914, Ford implemented the moving assembly line. It used the principles of scientific management, where each job has one best way of being accomplished, to bring unprecedented efficiency to manufacturing. Assembly time per car dropped to just 90 minutes. That year the Ford plant in Highland Park, Michigan, produced almost 250,000 Model Ts. To keep up with ever-rising demand, operations were sped up and capacity increased to the point that one day in 1925, Ford produced one Model T every 10 seconds. That year the car retailed for just $295, making the so-called Tin Lizzie, or the Flivver, accessible to working-class families. By 1927, when Ford retired the Model T so the company could respond to consumer demand for cars with better performance, power, and styling, the company had turned out 15 million Tin Lizzies. Ford's innovative Model T, a reliable, no-nonsense, mass-produced automobile. Manufactured on a moving assembly line, brought mobility within the reach of the average American. It had changed consumer mindset to view the car as a necessity.
What was the Night of Terror?
It is a little-known episode in the American suffragist movement that took place on November 14, 1917, at the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. After President Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, took office in January 1917, activists began picketing daily outside the White House, demanding the right to vote for women. It was the first time in history that demonstrators had marched at the White House. The suffragists carried banners that read, "Mr.
What were the intolerable acts?
The so-called intolerable acts, also known as the coercive acts, were 5 laws passed by the British Parliament early in 1774, intended to assert British authority in the Massachusetts colony. The measures were seen as punishment for the Boston Tea Party, December 1773. In brief, the laws enacted the following: closure of the port of Boston, an English trial for any British officer or soldier who was charged with murder in the colonies, the change of the Charter of Massachusetts such that the council had to be appointed by the British and that town meetings could not be held without the British appointed governor's permission, the requirement that the colonists house and feed British soldiers, and the extension of the province of Quebec southward to the Ohio River. While the British intention was to bring the Massachusetts colony under control, and actually the Fifth Act was not intended to have any punitive effect on the colony. The result was instead to unite all the colonies in opposition to British rule. In this regard, the Acts are seen as a precursor to the American Revolution, 1775–83.
How did cable TV develop?
The industry had its beginnings in the 1970s, when home box office HBO started to beam its signal to customers on a subscription basis. It was a radical concept: let audiences pay direct for the programming, in this case, movies. rather than having it wholly supported through advertising and, in some cases, syndication fees. Another development during that decade proved to have lasting effect: Southern businessman Ted Turner. 1938, bought an independent TV station based in Atlanta and dubbed it a superstation. WTBS was soon made available to some 10 million subscribing households and was the beginning of Turner's cable TV empire, which would later include cable news network, CNN, CNN's headline news, Turner Network Television, TNT, and, briefly, the music network VH1. Soon there were a number of niche-based cable networks airing programming around the clock: music television, MTV, was reaching teens and 20-somethings, Lifetime targeted women, ESPN focused on sports, black entertainment television. BET, catered to the African American audience, and American movie classics, AMC, appealed to a cross-section of American viewers who share a fondness for old, mostly black and white, movies. By the 1980s, the three major television networks, which had risen to power in the 1950s and had remained on the top of their game for the next 2 decades, found that their audience share was dropping. This was aided by the introduction of the upstart Fox television network, backed by media mogul Rupert Murdoch, 1931. Fox's programming, geared toward a young, hip, and increasingly multicultural audience, found its own following. Soon Americans had more choices than ever before, and for a relatively low subscription cost. By the 1990s, the big three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, were reaching only 61% of the television audience. Not to be beaten at their own game, the networks responded to the new competition by producing more cutting-edge shows, programs that likely would not have made it on the air before the advent of cable. Further, they began charging their affiliate stations for programming, a trend begun by CBS in 1992.
What was the Bolshevik Revolution?
It was the November 1917 revolution in which the Bolsheviks, an extremist faction within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, later renamed the Russian Communist Party, seized control of the government, ushering in the Soviet age. The event is also known as the October Revolution, since by the old Russian calendar, in use until 1918. The government takeover happened on October 25. The Bolshevik Revolution was the culmination of a series of events in 1917. In March, with Russia still in the midst of World War I, 1914-18, the country faced hardship. Shortages of food and fuel made conditions miserable. The people had lost faith in the war effort and were loath to support it by sending any more young men into battle. In the Russian capital of Petrograd, which had been known as St. Petersburg until 1914, workers went on strike and rioting broke out. In the chaos, called the March Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II, 1868-1918, ordered the legislative body the Duma, to disband. Instead, the representatives set up a provisional government. Having lost all political influence, Nicholas abdicated the throne on March 15. He and his family were imprisoned and are believed to have been killed in July of the following year. Hearing of Nicholas's abdication, longtime political exile Vladimir Lenin. 1870–1924, returned from Europe to Petrograd, where he led the Bolsheviks in rallying the Russian people with calls for peace, land reform, and worker empowerment. Their slogan was land, peace, and bread. The Bolsheviks grew in numbers and became increasingly radical, in spite of efforts by the provisional government headed by revolutionary Alexander Kerensky, 1881–1970, to curb the Bolsheviks' influence. The only socialist member of the first provisional government, Kerensky's government proved ineffective and failed to meet the demands of the people. He also failed to end the country's involvement in World War I, which the Bolsheviks viewed as an imperialistic war. On November 7 the Bolsheviks led workers and disgruntled soldiers and sailors in a takeover of Petrograd's Winter Palace, the scene of Bloody Sunday in 1905, and which had become the headquarters of Kerensky's provisional government. By November 8 the provisional government had fallen.
What was a papal state?
A papal state was a manor or fief where the lord was a member of the clergy. In 754 Carolingian King Pepin the Short, c. 714–768, granted extensive lands to the Pope. These territories, which included much of what is now the Mediterranean coast of France as well as most of central Italy, were organized by the Roman Catholic Church into states. These states played an important role in medieval life. Like the fiefs, the papal states collected taxes and maintained courts of law. Also, like their secular counterparts, they were prone to war and invasion. Thus members of the Roman Catholic Church were temporal as well as spiritual leaders during the Middle Ages, 500–1350. The last of the territories held by the Church was in central Italy and included Rome. After 1871 these lands were claimed by Italy. The resulting land dispute, sometimes referred to as the Roman Question, was settled by the Lateran Treaty, 1929, which created the sovereign state known as Vatican City.
How could so many people, Hutus, have participated in the mass cleansing?
Experts point to Rwanda's deeply divided history. The rivalry between Hutus and Tutsis dates back hundreds of years since the Tutsis first arrived in the Central African region in the 14th century.
How do the 2004 Southeast Asia tsunamis rank among natural disasters?
The Southeast Asia tsunamis killed more people than any tsunami ever recorded. The series of seismic waves that rushed across the Indian Ocean on December 26, 2004, caused damage of biblical proportions and prompted a humanitarian rescue and aid effort on an unprecedented scale. That morning a 9.0 earthquake occurred off the northwestern tip of the island of Sumatra, Indonesia. Witnesses to the tsunamis reported that following the earthquake, ocean waters receded from shorelines hours before the giant waves roared in, washing over islands and sweeping through coastal villages in 12 countries, including Indonesia, Myanmar, India, and Sri Lanka. The waves struck as far west as the coast of Africa. More than 150,000 people died in the disaster. Indonesia's death toll alone surpassed 85,000. The international response was immediate and reached into the billions of dollars. Nonetheless, relief efforts were hampered by remote island locations, the destruction of infrastructure, and ongoing conflicts in some areas. In the weeks following the tsunamis, officials recognized that the true death toll would take time to be known, since survivors had yet to be interviewed about relatives and friends who remained missing. It was expected that many had been washed out to sea and thus had not been counted in the initial death toll, which was based on body counts. A preliminary report from the World Bank put the damages at $4.5 billion in Indonesia alone. But officials acknowledged that it would take months to calculate damages. The earthquake that struck the morning of December 26, 2004, was the third biggest earthquake in the past 100 years, and the biggest since 1964, when a 9.2 magnitude tremor occurred off Alaska. Scientists believe that the Southeast Asia quake occurred about 6.2 miles beneath the ocean floor and caused a great protrusion in the seabed, generating waves that moved across the ocean in the early morning hours. Though probably not huge when they were out at sea, the waves grew higher as they approached shore, as tremendous volumes of water were forced to the surface.
How did modern dance begin?
American dancer and choreographer Martha Graham, 1894–1991, is the acknowledged creator of modern dance. She was 35 years old when the Martha Graham Dance Group made its debut on April 14, 1929. Ushering in a new era in dance performance. The new form of dance dissolved the separation between mind and body and relied on technique that was built from within. Graham's interest in dance had begun in her youth, and as an astute observer and manipulator of light and space, she came to be regarded later in life as one of the masters of the modernist movement on a par with artist Pablo Picasso, 1881–1973. She is credited with revolutionizing dance as an art form. In her hands it had become nonlinear and non-representational theater. Choreographing some 180 works in her lifetime, she also taught many students who rose to prominence as accomplished and masterful dancers, including Merce Cunningham and Paul Taylor.